let's get into the big topic of open source, something that we actually say at Red Hat.
We haven't
This is so
we
awesome.
are an open culture that believes
actually
in
a big
importance of
piece
What is that process that a developer, or let's say
as the Kubernetes ecosystem really boomed.
Hello and welcome to this week's Ask an OpenShift Admin Office Hours live stream. You may notice that I am here and by myself. So Johnny is unfortunately occupied. Uh-oh, and I have an echo. I have to figure out where all of this noise is coming from. Here we go. Too many tabs open, as is sometimes the case. So I thought I had muted all of the other YouTubes and Twitches and everything else, but yeah, it turns out I had one of them. So I was hearing myself, which is incredibly distracting for anyone who's ever had to go through that. So yeah, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's stream. So this week I am by myself. Johnny will be here next week, although I will not be here next week. So we're trading off based on things that we've got going on. He's presenting to a group of chief architects, I think he said. So, always something fun, always something exciting going on. So today's episode, or today's stream rather, is going to be focused on the agent-based installer. So agent-based installer is something that has been in progress for a while and was recently GA'd alongside OpenShift 4.10. So this one is interesting. It's kind of, it's a little bit different experience. We've talked a lot about the install experience here on the stream over the last 2.5 years. Gosh, more than that. It's almost been 3 years, I think, since we started streaming. Today's March 1st. I think the first of the live streams here on Red Hat live streaming were in early April. I want to say maybe it was May. I want to say May 4th, because I remember somebody making a joke about May the 4th, May the Force. So yeah, it's been quite the exciting 3 years almost. So Khalid, hello. Yes, I will be showing a demo of walking through the agent-based installer. I was chatting with the product manager a little bit earlier, and he shared some slides and some other stuff with me. And it's interesting to see the bigger perspective. I'll share a little bit of that here, and we can, of course, have a conversation about that. But I was really pleasantly surprised as I was going through and testing things and experimenting with it and learning all this if I'm being honest, it's kind of a boring demo. And that's a good thing. The install experience should be easy. It should be low effort. It should be not exciting, if you will. I always find it interesting, strange, hilarious when it's like just getting something installed is exciting. Like, no, that's the least exciting part of the whole experience. Like everything after that, all of the OpenShift goodness and everything. That's what we really want to talk about and focus on. So yeah, I'll definitely show a demo. Like I said, it's there's a couple of nuances I'll say, but it's really straightforward. So before we get to that, I will do a quick couple of top of mind things, but I also want to remind everyone who is with us here that this is one of our office hours series of live streams here on Red Hat Live Streaming. So that means that you can ask a question about anything that comes to mind, anything that's bothering you, that you're having problems with, that you're just curious about. Feel free to ask those questions in chat, and we'll do our best to get to those here on the stream. If we don't know the answer, I keep saying we as though I'm not the only one here. I'm just so used to having Johnny with me. So if we don't know the answer, we will find that out and we can answer those. You can also reach out to me on various social media platforms, etc. So you can find me at andrew.sullivan@redhat.com or at Practical Andrew on the various social media platforms. I will say that these days email is almost easier for me. I just realized this morning, because it's the first time that I've done any tweeting in quite a while. Johnny's been handling a lot of that stuff, that I had a whole bunch of like unread messages. So my apologies to anybody who has sent me anything. I think there was some from as far back as like last December. I hope I have responded to everyone. If not, please don't be afraid to reach out again. I promise I'll do a better job of keeping an eye on those and responding. So feel free to reach out to me anytime. Again, andrew.sullivan@redhat.com. We love to get questions. We love to hear from y'all. Our Hope None, I don't know if you're on. I got your email this morning. I've already sent it off, and it's already over with engineering, where they're validating the issue that you encountered, which was around a incorrect URL being specified for the Insights operator and whitelisting. So they're validating everything, and they'll get all of that updated. So they moved very quick on that one. It was literally within like 2 minutes of me sending the email, like, "Oh yeah, we'll check on this," and then 5 minutes later, "Yeah, this looks like it changed, but we're not sure why you're seeing it now." And the conversation continued from there. So, all right, top of mind topics. Got way too many tabs open as usual. So first, let me share my screen. And the first one I want to talk about is this OpenShift virtualization tuning and scaling guide. Let me turn off my name being at the bottom of that. And let me make it a little bit bigger since you don't need to see me. So this was recently released by the OpenShift virtualization engineering team, and it walks through just a huge number of different things regarding, well, tuning and scaling OpenShift, specifically for OpenShift virtualization. I skimmed through this. I read through a couple of parts around it, and I actually learned a few things around. So if we scroll down here, like tested maximums, here's their tested maximums for virtual machines, 10,000 concurrently running virtual machines inside of a single cluster. But I thought this was interesting down here. So like scheduling. I did not know, for example, that you can change this node status max image count in order to affect scheduling. So they walk through the explanation here, but essentially, one of the things that affects the scheduler score for any particular pod is whether or not the image that pod uses already exists on the node. So if I have, 10 nodes in the cluster, and each one of those nodes is running, 100 different pods, that could be 100 different images. And if I schedule a new pod, uh, it will factor in whether or not, maybe 2 of those 10 nodes already has the image there. Well, it would more heavily favor those 2 nodes. But, and as we see here, the default number of container images that it uses to adjust that or factor into that scheduling is only 50. So in a large cluster, a busy cluster, and especially a cluster that has a very large disk, or a node that has a very large disk, there could be hundreds of images that are on that node. So basically this is saying, let's change that to be, well, basically unlimited, so that it returns back all of the images and it plays into that score. I will say, like everything, or anytime you do any kind of performance tuning or anything like that, always be cognizant of behavior before and after. So what do I mean by that? A long time ago, I was a DBA, and I've been a storage admin, a virtualization admin. Every vendor ever has these types of performance and tuning guides, and it's important to understand what your performance baseline is now, and then make a change, preferably only one at a time, and then establish what that change or how that change affected your environment. So before, I was seeing X number of IOPS. I made a change. Was that change positive? Did it impact, positively or negatively against what was happening in your cluster? Did it have the desired effect, more or less? Raul, hello from Switzerland. Hi, it's kind of late in the day, so thank you for joining us there at the end of your day. Collection of cells. Unfortunately, I have no effect on internships. So I believe that it's kind of late in the year for internships. I thought that they'd already posted all of those, but you can check the Red Hat jobs portal, which is simply jobs.redhat.com, and you can look at those, and they'll go through, and basically it's just like getting hired at Red Hat. I would also strongly suggest working through your university. So, for example, I'm based in the RTP, the Research Triangle Park area, and Red Hat has a lot of partnerships. I'll call them close ties. I don't know the right word there, but with like NC State University, University of North Carolina, so on and so forth. And so, your university's internship office can also work with us in order to identify those. In previous years, I've participated in a number of intern events where we basically go to those colleges and recruit and talk with folks and, hey, this is what this position is, or this is what this type of thing means and stuff like that. But internships are ultimately, who gets selected is ultimately based on the manager that's hiring that intern. And I am a manager, but I don't have any internships on my team, unfortunately. So, anyways, so as you flip through this, as you look through this, let me share the URL for this. So I should have done that earlier, shouldn't I? So as you look through this particular article, definitely take an eye to just all the different things that can be in here. So it is specific to OpenShift virtualization, but there were some things in here that I haven't seen before. Here, Kube API burst queries per second. Here's some VM tuning, right? So on and so forth. So even if you're not using OpenShift virtualization, it may have some interesting stuff in here for you, just about other aspects of OpenShift, of Kubernetes, and how to manage those. So yeah, here, reserve system CPUs, just all kinds of stuff here. It's reserving entire CPUs for system level operations. So lots and lots of information here. I find this to be a fascinating guide that I need to go through and read in depth. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about here in the top of mind topics is around vSphere. And in particular, we get asked fairly regularly, by customers who are deploying OpenShift onto vSphere. They ask their account team, who comes back and asks us on the OpenShift team, hey, can VMware or can OpenShift control and manage things like affinity or anti-affinity rules for OpenShift nodes? And the answer to that is, at least for now, no. So the rationale being a couple of different things. So one, we don't necessarily understand what the goals or the configuration, the desired state of that vSphere cluster is, according to what the administrator wants. So if we were to just go in and say, oh yeah, I want to create, a new anti-affinity group or a new affinity group and, set its anti-affinity against these hosts and all that, that could be completely incorrect based off of what, the administrator wants. So if I look at this cluster here, you've got 5 nodes that are running inside of this cluster. And it might be that, they don't want the administrator for this cluster, which, to be clear, is not me, by the way, even though I am logged in as the administrator. So the administrator for the cluster, may not want to have my control plane nodes, running or pinned to nodes 1, 2, and 3, have any anti-affinity set on them at all. So we don't understand necessarily what those mean, and we would need to introduce a lot of logic in order to help define those rules and stuff like that. In addition to that, usually the first complaint or the first pushback we get back on those is simply permissions. vCenter admins don't necessarily want to give cluster level permissions because you need permission at this level in order to set or create those rules and manage those rules. So a lot of times that's where we get a lot of pushback as well. For example, I had a conversation with some folks earlier this week because their customer didn't want to have tagging based permissions. So if we look in the docs and go down to 12, and let's see, installing and vSphere, preparing to install on vSphere. So there's a whole list of, I thought it was in there. Must be on this one. Yeah, so there's a whole list of permissions that are needed in vCenter. And among those, you see at the vCenter level, so at the very top level, if I come over here at this level inside of my vCenter, it needs to have tagging permissions. So these tags are created by the CSI driver, by the machine API interface, in order to basically identify what resources belong to a specific cluster. And they, for whatever reason, in the VMware world, those exist at the top level. So this customer, very understandably, their admins were hesitant around giving, that type of permission at such a large level or such a high level. again, we hear the same thing about DRS rules, about affinity rules when you look at these. If I come in here, look at configure, and I go to DRS is turned on, and now I don't remember how to get to affinity rules. Here we go, host groups. So in here, I can create host groups. So maybe I have, one or all the way up to 5 of these hosts that I want to put into a specific group for whatever reason. And then I create a VM to host rule where I can then either associate those VMs with those nodes or anti-affinity, prevent them from running on those, prevent them from running together, all of that type of stuff. So again, that's the main concern. I would definitely encourage anyone and everyone to work with their vSphere admins to put in place policies that make sense for you. So what does that mean? So policies that make sense for you are going to change on a case-by-case basis. Generally speaking, in my opinion, most everyone will want to have anti-affinity rules for the control plane nodes, meaning we don't want to have all 3 control plane nodes running on, say, a single physical server. We want to have them, ideally distributed across one on each one on a different node. So that way, if a single physical server fails, we don't lose our control plane quorum. That being said, I would suggest that they are soft affinity rules or anti-affinity rules, not hard anti-affinity rules. So the difference is a hard rule means that it will not turn on that virtual machine if it violates the rule. A soft rule means allow the VM to run, but when it can meet that requirement or that take action. So basically DRS in that case would then vmotion the virtual machine to a different node in order to regain the affinity status. The reason why this is important is, let's say that I have, I lose several of these hosts and now I don't have enough hosts to actually restart. I lose 3 of my 5, assuming I have enough capacity to tolerate that. Without violating the hard rule, it wouldn't be able to restart the control plane node. With a soft rule, it will restart the VMs. That way I can reprotect, etcd, it'll have 3 nodes for quorum. And then as I reintroduce hardware, it would continue to protect things. So infrastructure nodes, similar type of decision. I think it'll depend on what's running on those infra nodes. So for example, if you have infra nodes that are doing ingress, then maybe you want to protect those in a similar way, right? Of anti-affinity rules to keep them on separate hosts. So that way, if one host goes down, you don't suddenly lose all ingress capabilities into your cluster. So having, I think 2 is the minimum recommended number of ingress controllers with OpenShift anyways, but you can scale that up as well if you so choose. Other infra services are going to depend. If you're running ODF, ODF, you would probably not want to have those running on the same node for the same reasons. Losing too many ODF nodes means that your storage would go down, which means that your apps that are using that persistent storage would go down. Is there a way to get vSphere from the OpenShift GUI? No, not that I'm aware of. So in theory, you could go in and you could pull the credentials if you have the right permissions. So for example, if you're a cluster administrator, you would have access to go in and look at the vsphere.conf file. So let's see. I am looking for the right. Here we go. So I'm looking for a specific KCS here. If I go to this KCS, let me share this in the chat as well. So if I go to this KCS, it talks about how to modify the vSphere configuration. So as a cluster administrator, I have access to look at this secret, right? I can get the username and password. These are just base64 encoded. And as I scroll down, I can also do things like look at the vsphere.conf file and all this. So you could, again, as that VMware or as that OpenShift cluster administrator, you can extract the credentials, and then down here it'll have, here's my vCenter server. So you could point your browser at that. You could use those credentials to log in. You would have whatever permissions have been granted to the OpenShift cluster at that point. So take that into account. Definitely work with your VMware administrators so that the way they understand any impact and any threat that's associated with that. Some customers, just anecdotally, from my experience talking with a lot of different folks, some customers will have one effectively service account in vCenter that all of their OpenShift clusters use. Some customers will have one service account per OpenShift cluster. It's really entirely dependent up to your model and how you choose to do it. I think that got through everything I was going to say. So yeah, just be aware of these types of things. Another thing, so with OpenShift 4.12, so announced, so in the what's new in OpenShift 4.12, we announced the, is that it? Nope. The ability to do zone-based provisioning. Eventually I'll find this as I'm trying to click and talk at the same time, which is never a good idea for me. Here we go. Zone awareness. So this is a tech preview feature where you can go in and effectively, can I make this bigger? Okay. We're just going to let that keep going. I don't know how do I open these slides? There we go. Here, that's a little easier to see. So as I get out here to the right place, so basically zone awareness is tech preview with OpenShift 4.12. So this enables behavior that's very similar to how AWS works. So essentially I go into vCenter and I create labels for different hosts, different groups of hosts inside of my environment. So you see the example they use here is I have a data center that has been assigned a region. So US East 1 mimicking AWS. And then I have different clusters that have been assigned different zones. So US East 1A, B, and C. And then over here, I have a separate data center. So keep in mind, these are same vCenter, separate data centers in that vCenter. So over here, one vCenter, but here I've only got one data center named Boston. So maybe I would have one for, our RDU or our RTP, maybe one for, SFO or something like that. So these data centers would have labels, and then each one of the clusters would have labels if I had more than one. And then basically what happens is, and it doesn't show it in here, what happens is when I go and create my cluster, when I go to deploy my OpenShift cluster, I specify I want different nodes to be created in each one of these zones. So for comparison's sake, what is this? Here we go. So here is a AWS cluster. If I come in here and look at my machine sets, come on. Dwayne, not necessarily like a VLAN, more like AWS availability zones is what they're going for. I don't know what's going on here. Why is this cluster? Apparently I got logged out. That's fun. Here we go. So machine sets. So you see here I have a machine set for US East 2A, 2B, 2C. So that 2A, I look at the YAML here, represents the availability zone in the region that it's using. So we effectively implement the same type of mechanism in vSphere with that. Just keep in mind it's tech preview, which means that it's not supported. But if you're interested, you can go in and you can check that out today with OpenShift 4.12. So as you saw just a moment ago when I was showing my vCenter, I don't have enough resources to actually test that or demo that, rather. So maybe we can figure out something and I can show that at a future date. I'm going to turn off my name down in the corner there just to keep it from interfering. Okay, so yeah, please let me know if there's any questions about that. I know VMware being by far the most popular data center hypervisor, most folks have some cluster that's running on vSphere, so there's always questions and stuff like that. So don't hesitate to ask those questions. All right. Let me close some things here just to get organized, and that is all of the top of mind topics that I had for today. Yep, that guy can go away. So, Dwayne, VLAN, not really, because VLANs are meant to be network level segmentation. So if you think of it as a host, and I'm kind of making this up as I go here, so please forgive me. So if you think of it in terms of a VLAN, VLANs provide segmentation, but not necessarily resiliency. The goal here, or the goal with the VMware zones, is to provide resiliency so that if my DRS cluster, for whatever reason, fails, maybe I have one cluster in each rack row in my data center. Maybe I have multiple server closets, and each VMware DRS cluster represents one closet at that particular site. Effectively, the goal is to spread my OpenShift nodes across all of those to provide resiliency against a larger scale failure. So larger scale here being larger than a single or a couple of nodes, right, all the way up to a DRS cluster level, but not a full site-wide failure, because it would be, I guess it depends on how you do architect your VMware data centers. Do keep in mind that, even though I only have some here, but yes, you could technically go in and do something, like I said before, where you've got, say Boston, North Carolina, California, I'm spreading these out geographically. Yes, you can technically spread a cluster across all of those sites, but remember there are constraints associated with that. Let's see, I've got a link for this. So there is a KCS that is relevant here. So guidance for deployment spanning multiple sites. So I'll share this in chat. And effectively this walks through, like, yes, it's supported to do this, but you have to meet certain, certain things in order to be successful. So for example, network requirements, store requirements, workload placement considerations. So this is really great KCS if you're interested in, spanning a cluster. Usually the biggest thing is quite simply latency. You want to ensure that etcd, the control plane nodes, have low enough both network and average latency to be able to meet the requirements of your cluster. So requirements of your cluster here being like how many API calls are happening, how many object reads and writes and updates are happening in etcd, all of that type of stuff. Remember, adding latency to etcd limits scalability for your cluster, because it has to be able to commit those objects, has to be able to write those objects. So if you're doing a bunch of operations and it can't commit them fast enough, you basically have to reduce the number of operations. Mira, no, we haven't gotten to the agent-based installer yet because I've been rambling about vSphere and DRS and affinity rules. Agent-based installer compatible with UPI or only IPI? Actually, I have not gotten it to work with IPI. I've only gotten it to work with UPI. I've done both a platform none install, and I'll show that here in just a moment. And then I've also done, although I will admit not fully successfully, a platform vSphere deployment. But I've only created the VMs with that. I have not done an IPI with that. Any role considerations? I'm not sure what you mean there, Tim. Role considerations across zones in the cloud. I don't know if you're referring to like permissions, IAM roles or something like that. Just if you can clarify in the chat there. Okay, so I'll quit rambling about vSphere. Don't hesitate to ask any questions that you happen to have, and I'll answer those to the best of my ability as we go forward. So let's talk about the agent-based installer. So the agent-based installer is I'll call a new method of installing OpenShift that is really focused on kind of getting what I'm going to call cluster 0 up and running inside of your environment. So this is particularly true with say disconnected installs, where it's hard to get access to a bastion host or something like that inside of that environment, where I want to, from a connected node, be able to go in, create this image, and then as well as the registry that it needs to deploy, and then move those over to that environment, basically attach my image, my one ISO to my host, boot it up, and now I have a cluster that's up and running that I can then use as that foothold to deploy further, add ACM or something like that and deploy further clusters in that environment. I think it's also useful in a couple of other scenarios. So for example, maybe I have a bunch of smaller sites. So I'm sitting at the regional or the central site for my company, and one of the smaller sites needs an OpenShift cluster instantiated. Well, I can create the image. I can hand it off to somebody who's there. They don't need to be really skilled. They basically attach the ISO, turn it on, and after some time, we have a cluster that's up and running. They don't need to provide any input or anything like that. So this blog post, which is created by the product management and product marketing teams, blog posts through a number of different aspects, including down here as we get through. And I think this was created before GA. Yeah. So it was created before GA. So they mentioned some quirks that are no longer applicable. But then is that we walk through, we create our traditional install config that tells us about our cluster. All these things are standard for a bare metal cluster. Here you can see Ben created this. He is specifying a disconnected mirror. So just like you would with any other disconnected cluster, you use OC mirror to go in and create the install registry for that. And then we also specify an additional trust bundle. So basically the certificate that it will use for that particular registry. And then from there, we need to agent config file, which tells it a couple of different things. So one, this rendezvous IP is going to be the IP of one of the nodes that will act as the bootstrap node. So the agent-based installer uses the self-bootstrap model that we see with other assisted installer type installs. So in this instance, this IP happens to equate to the first VM. So this VM will come up and it will act as the bootstrap for the other two nodes. And then once that's done, it will restart and it will shift over to being a regular control plane node. The other aspect that we see here is configuring the network associated with each one of these. Here on my first host here, I'm telling it what interfaces I want to use, and then I'm telling it how to configure those interfaces. So here it's a very simple, one network adapter that I'm going to assign an IP address on, tell it where the DNS server is, and tell it where its default route is. But you can also do things like create a bond. You can add VLAN interfaces, all that other stuff. And telling it, so this is telling us how to configure each node's network. So one thing that's important here, you'll notice in this example that Ben has created, there's 3 different hosts. When we do this, and I'm going to show an example of this in just a moment, it generates a single ISO. And that means that it provides the same network config to each of the hosts, in this case 3, each 3 hosts that get booted. And that's why our MAC address information is really important here. Because essentially, if that MAC address, if that host doesn't have this MAC address, then it's just skip over this config. Here we've got FD, F3, and B918. So when this ISO is booted on, this VM, it's going to say, well, I don't have this network adapter, so I'm not going to apply that config. I don't have this network adapter. I'm not going to apply this config. I only have this network adapter, so this is the config I will apply. So that is something MAC addresses are required when we go through and do this. And for Mira, who's just asking about IPI, that's why I haven't been able to do an IPI install with this. You do get a integrated cluster, so you can create machine sets if you're doing it in vSphere. You can create machine sets and you can deploy VMs after that, but it doesn't deploy out of the box. Does it work across all cloud providers and also provide bare metal? Steve, are you referring to the agent-based installer? Yeah, I should have read your very next message. No. Today it only works with the either a non-integrated, so platform none cluster, a platform bare metal cluster, or a vSphere integrated cluster. I believe that they have plans to add others in the future, but I don't know what those are off the top of my head. Our Hope 9 reading feature for console banners only available during upgrades. Hopefully we see another customization episode soon. Oh, yes. That's a good point. Our Hope 9, one of the things that Johnny and I have talked about is the dynamic plugins for the OpenShift console. There's some really cool stuff there. I think we talked about during the What's New stream, and it's something that we hope to show off. How do you set up the MAC addresses? So you don't really set them up so much as retrieve them. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So first, I will also share the documentation link because more or less we're going to be following along with the documentation here. So that's an important one to have if you are interested in using the agent-based installer. And then next, I will move over and look at my particular cluster here. So inside of my environment here, inside of my Bastion host or my admin host, if you will, I have my agent config file and my install config file. So for this particular cluster, and I need to check something here real quick and make sure that I'm not going to accidentally expose my so I've done that before. Yeah. Okay, so we need to do. Sorry, I'm typing. I'm making sure that I'm not going to accidentally mess myself up here. All right, so over here in my environment, I want to deploy a new single node OpenShift cluster. So let's move my existing instance. I'm going to create a new directory to operate out of. I've got a new directory there. What I want to do, and this is just a single ESXi host, I want to do is deploy single node OpenShift onto a virtual machine just as soon as this thing logs in. Come on. There we go. So I have already created my virtual machine inside of here. So you can see this is just a RHEL 8 virtual machine, just like you would always use with VMware and OpenShift. And importantly, over here under networking, not under that networking, under this networking, it tells me the MAC address that VMware has assigned to the virtual machine. So that MAC address is what I want to use for in my install config, or my install config, my agent config. So 068, which I think I've already got in here. So more agent config. In my agent config, you can see I'm giving it the rendezvous IP, which is just going to be this single node. And then I have my host name. Host name is, for this one, should be unimportant, but we'll see. And then, 06 alpha 3 is the MAC address that we just saw. I will say that sometimes when creating a VM, it won't give you the MAC address right away. It'll wait to generate it and assign it until after the VM has been powered on the first time. So if that happens, so let me see if that happens here. So create a VM. Yes. Give it just a quick name here. RHEL 8. Yep. I want that one. So I'm not going to use this VM. So we can just click finish here real quick. And if I click on this, so you can see I don't have a MAC address yet, right? It says automatic. So if I just turn this VM on, and it's not going to do anything. It's basically going to go into a boot loop where it's going to say that there's no bootable device found. So I can just power it right back off. And then, get out of here. And then if I come back over here to my network, now I've got a MAC address. So some hypervisor hosts do that, stuff like that. If you're running hardware, so if you're installing to a physical server, one thing that you can do is quite literally look at the hardware. Each network adapter will have a sticker that has the MAC address on it. You can also something like access your ILOM or your lights out management interface. Typically, all of the major server vendors in their interface there, they will have the MAC addresses and other information about the hardware, so you can pull it off that way. And then, of course, you can do something like boot into a live ISO. So, boot into a RHEL or a Fedora ISO or something like that, and then just do an IPA or an IP int. I don't remember the command off the top of my head. Is there any dependency for NFS3 on OpenShift regarding compatibility? No. Nope. NFS. So it depends. The only time there would be a dependency on any storage is if you're using PVCs inside of OpenShift. But the cluster itself doesn't need NFS to deploy or anything like that. So I'm not sure I fully understand the purpose of agent-based installer. Yeah. So agent-based installer is targeted at one of the main use cases is disconnected environments. So I can go in and basically I generate my ISO and then I hand that over and I boot the node in a disconnected environment and it goes and it installs the cluster. So you do need, just like with any OpenShift install, you do need a registry that has had all of the OpenShift version images mirrored. But you no longer have to have something like a Bastion host, right? A host where I go in and I do OpenShift install, create install config and OpenShift install, create manifests, and then, all of that other stuff in order to go through and deploy that. Instead, I do all of that maybe on my connected environment or from my admin workstation, and then I hand that ISO and to somebody else, and they go and boot that node, and it's able to go and do that install. So that's kind of the biggest use case is disconnected or other environments where I don't edge environments, remote environments where I don't have necessarily direct hands-on access or the easy ability to deploy a Bastion host that I can remotely administer and kick off an install from. So let's take a look at what this looks like here. And let me flip tabs. So Mira, please let me know if that answered your question or helped clarify. So coming back over here, so I have my agent config. We have my MAC address in here that's telling it, hey, use this interface. If I need to, if my device has more than one disk in it, so particularly with hardware, tell it which device I want it to use for installing CoreOS. I configure the IP address or this interface. So here I'm using a static IP, but I can as easily use DHCP just by setting, removing ENSA and setting DHCP to true, telling it where DNS is at, and I'm telling it its default route. And then aside from that, so if I do a head on -20 on my install config is just a standard install config. I'm only showing the first 20 or so lines here so that I don't show off my pull secret. So install or single node OpenShift deployment here. So the workers, I have 0 replicas. My control plane, I have 1 replica. Beyond that, my cluster name, telling it the machine networks like I always do, cluster network, so on and so forth, service network, pull secret, SSH key, just like with any other install. So my Snow cluster folder is empty here. I'm going to copy YAML into my Snow cluster directory. Got my 2 files in there. Just like with any other OpenShift config, it's going to consume those files. So now I can do OpenShift install agent create image, the command that we want. And I'll do log level equals debug so that we can output of what's going on here. So what it's doing here, just like with API install, it pulls down the image that it's going to use, right? So if I scroll back up here to using internal image. On my host, it happens to have already pulled down the release image, so I didn't have to wait for it to do that. It sets the rendezvous IP, extracting the ISO from the release payload. So the ISO is in this. You can see the command that it uses. The ISO is found within that container image that it pulls down. Blah, 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 assuming agent config, consuming install config. It builds out everything that I need. And if I go into my directory there, let's clear this so it's easier to read. Oh, there it is. Oh, I didn't set the directory. That's what happened. So when I ran my config, I set the log level to debug, but I did not add the -dir equals no cluster like I should have. So it used the ones that were in my directory. Anyways, attention to detail, folks. It's important. So anyways, same results, and I still have my backup or my 2 files here that I can use to regenerate this if I need to. So the end result is I now have this agent ISO, and I now have, just like again with any other OpenShift install, I have the auth directory. Inside the auth directory is going to be my kubadmin password and the kube config for connecting to the cluster. So what you'll notice isn't here is all of the ignition files that I would normally use for something like a UPI deployment. So let's take this agent, and I want to copy that over to my ESXi host. All I'm doing is an SCP taking that agent ISO, and then I'm putting it over on my vSphere host here in that one data store. So there are hundreds of ways that you can do this. I happen to be doing it in the way that is the least effort and probably the least secure way of doing it, which is copying it directly to my ESXi host. It's a live stream. It's a demo. It's okay. So if I come here to storage, look in my ESX01 data store and go to data store browser, you see that I now have my agent ISO. You can see it was created today, Wednesday, March 1st. Fun of flying for 10 hours to run the install. Yeah, yes, it does. I hope not. Going to edge sites or any kind of remote site where there's not a primary administrator is a pain. And I don't want to think about SCP going away. That's not okay. So coming back to our virtual machine here. So one thing I am going to do, because I used this virtual machine as a test yesterday, I'm going to remove the disk that's here and add a new one. So the reason I'm doing that is because by default, the boot order it'll boot to the disk first and the CD second. Since it already has an install on there on that disk, I don't, I need to add a blank disk so that way it'll move to the second one. I could also go in and adjust the boot order, but it's a VM, it's a disk, it's super easy to add. A new disk is going to be 200 gigabytes in size. So I'm using the sizing guidance for single node OpenShift here. So 8 CPUs, 24 gigs of memory. Hit save. So it now has a blank drive. And then I need to go back to edit because I want to set my CD drive to boot to our data store ISO. So the agent install ISO. I want to connect it power on. And now we can turn on our virtual machine. You can see it already booted to the CoreOS Live ISO. So it'll go through and it'll continue along its merry way, booting into CoreOS. So from over here, if this is, if whatever host you're using for this is, you can connect to your agent-based install node, if that makes sense. Basically, my admin host here, which is Anchor, I have network connectivity over to where this is being deployed at, which means I can do things like use the OpenShift install agent wait for bootstrap complete command, just like I do with any other OpenShift. If you don't have that connectivity, it's fine. It'll still continue to do its thing. But so You can see down here, get out of here, here at the info level, waiting for the cluster install to initialize. So basically it's waiting for something to happen. Over here, we can see some activity happening as it's going through various aspects of deploying the cluster. So 1 host expected, 0 host not validated. It's going through and doing all these things. It'll do things like if you've ever done an agent or a assisted installer based install before, it does a bunch of validation. So it's running things in behind the scenes like, is the storage fast enough? Does it have a low enough latency to reasonably expect the cluster to successfully deploy? Is there enough memory? Is there enough CPU? Right? All of those normal assisted installer types of checks. Asks us for PV PVC, not for agent-based installation, Manoj. Yeah, there's no dependency for NFS3 for anything inside of OpenShift. So if I switch over here to a already deployed cluster, and I come to storage, so this is again a AWS deployed cluster. If I look at my persistent volumes, you can see that there are none. I deployed the entire cluster, and it has no persistent volumes that I've created. Some services that you deploy can optionally take advantage of RWX, read write many storage, for example, NFS storage, but you don't have to. You don't need that. So, for example, if you deploy the registry, if you want to have a scaled registry, so 2, 3, 4 instances of the registry pod running with the same storage backend, then you would want RWX storage. However, I would also recommend object storage in that case, if that's an option. But yeah, there's no dependency for NFS, but your applications can absolutely take advantage of it if you want to or need to. Switch back over here. So you can see it's continuing to give me information about what's happening inside of there. Cluster is ready for install. Preparing cluster for installation. Host, the first one, so master 0 that I had booted is preparing for installation. Coming over here, you can see I get similar information about it. Cluster installation in progress. So from here, we just wait. So yesterday it was taking, I don't know, about 15 minutes for the cluster to deploy, or at least for this process to finish. And then it takes another little while for it to completely finish deploying the cluster. It does exactly what it says it does. It's really straightforward, which is really nice. So you can download it 400 megabytes. Apparently my internet is fast today. But I'm not going to look at that, continue to watch this. We'll let it run in the background here, because what I also want to show is, can we do this with a different, with a VMware integrated cluster? So this one is a little bit different. So if I go to here, I'm on a different node. This guy. So inside of here, I have similar type of thing. I have my install config. I have my agent config here. So if I look at my install config, this one is conveniently named clean because I have not added my secret in here. So that way I can, I can show it. So this one is going to be a little bit different. So a couple of things to note in here. So just like any other OpenShift integrated install, I provide my platform vSphere. In this case, you'll notice that I'm giving it the 2 VIPs, API VIP and Ingress VIP. So this is not an IPI install, right? It's not going to boot up, and it's not going to connect, and it's not going to provision a bunch of VMs. Rather, I'm going to hand it the VMs that it's going to use, and it's going to use this for my quote-unquote load balancer, just like IPI would. And then I provide all the other information that's here. So, well, I hope it's not having dropouts. Please let me know if that continues, Peter. So yeah, that would be, please let me know if that continues. Although I did notice a little bit ago that my browser was acting a little bit funny. So maybe there's, in typical fashion, I've just got too many tabs open. That would not surprise me in the least. Here, let's close that and see what happens. Okay. Let me see something. Let me see if I can check on something here with regard to what is causing, those dropouts. I think it's a resource issue on my host here, or on my desktop. Let's close you and see what happens. Oh yeah, there we go. Close gchat, and magically memory utilization drops by like 20%. Funny how that works. Okay, hopefully that will improve things a little bit. If it continues, just let me know, please. In the case of a non-single node cluster, how do we differentiate the provisioning of control plane / worker nodes if we are using the same ISO for both? So that would come in the agent config file, or the agent agent config file. So essentially, you declare the type of node that it is in those two files, and it configures it appropriately. I don't have an example here. I think actually, now I'm questioning myself of it might only support single node and compact clusters. Because now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know that in any of the documentation or examples I've seen where it deploys more than a 3-node compact cluster. So it might only be able to do that. I'm looking at a presentation just to see if it happens to mention it here. So it might only be able to do that. I'll confirm. I'll double check on that and share. So apologies for the confusion there. All right. So moving back over to our, this is my attempt, or I'm going to attempt to deploy a 3-node compact vSphere cluster with this. So here's my platform stanza with the VIPs that I'll be using, and then everything else is standard for an OpenShift install. And I've also have my agent config YAML. You can see here I'm doing the same thing. So rendezvous IP is going to be, in my instance, I'm just using the first node as my bootstrap, and then I'm configuring everything else inside of here according to how I need it to be. But that this root device hint isn't really necessary if you have the one device on here. I'm just leaving it in there for completeness sake. And let's see what's in here. Okay, so I do have an empty directory. One thing to note, what you're going to see here in just a moment, install agent create image dir equals blue. So what you're going to see here in just a moment is it's actually going to say that it's ignoring a bunch of the config, including all of my VMware configuration inside of here. Irritatingly, it prints those values. So what we should see, come on, you can get there. What we'll basically see is it's going to say, ignoring vCenter value, ignoring username value, ignoring password value, and all that. So the password that I've put in here is not the real password. So just FYI, if it ever actually gets there. I don't know what's going on. This cluster is rather busy, so sometimes these things lag. I don't know that I will expect my cluster deployment here to actually succeed just due to how busy the underlying VMware environment is. It gets laggy sometimes. So if I look at my monitor and go to advanced performance, yeah, you can see there we go. Yeah, see, for whatever reason, there's a storage spike that's happening right now. So I don't know what's going on with that, but if we switch over here, oh look, cluster bootstrap did not complete. Okay. So this one is restarting for whatever reason. So it's somewhere in the bootstrap process. I'll also note that the host that this is deployed to is also Cinder powered. So it runs a little bit slower than I would like it to, if I had better hardware, but it's going through. It's doing its boot. This is repeating itself because it's just taking a lot of time for me to. So here, writing CoreOS to disk, rebooting. Now it's just waiting for that reboot to finish. That's why it's scrolling those messages. And the node is in the process of rebooting. Did you get there? There it is. Okay. So you can see here, it echoes out all these values. So like I said, I put in dummy values here. So none of this is actual real values, just to be clear. So Davis, if you ever watch this, it's okay. Anyways, that'll eventually get there. And what we'll get is the exact same thing. We'll get an ISO. And my goal, if I don't run out of time here, my goal is to do effectively the same thing. So we'll come over here to our nodes. I'm going to go back to our VMs here because it's easier to read. And for each one of these nodes, I will attach that ISO. So I will edit our VM. And I need to remove our hard disk here, just like with the other one. Edit settings. Goodbye hard disk, because this cluster also has an existing OpenShift install, so I'm removing that here real quick. Whenever this guy finishes, it'll spit out an ISO, and then I will copy it over to the data store, just like I did with my other environment, attach it to our nodes, and then let them boot. Can we use Pixie to deploy automatically? Yeah, I would imagine so, but I haven't actually tried that. So in this instance, yeah, there's clicking, way more clicking than you would probably need as a result of me, doing things like adjusting disks, etc. But you could absolutely automate all of this. So maybe use Ansible to create a VMware or RHEL or whatever virtual machine. If you're installing on bare metal on a physical server, many of those have the ability to automate against their IPMI, ILOM, whatever interface. You could do it that way. I don't see any reason why you couldn't Pixie boot in order to accomplish that. So same sort of thing. Click back over here. Yep. So it's going through and doing its thing. I assume that'll eventually reconnect. This guy over here doing his thing. So I don't know what's going on there. These poor hosts are memory and CPU super high. Storage is very highly utilized. So I don't know what's going on. Anyways, I feel like this sets a bad example, but it has nothing to do with the agent-based installer. It's entirely my environment that I borrowed from engineering that is clearly busy doing engineering things and not Andrew doing live streaming things. So we'll let that guy continue along its way. We'll reconnect. This one is going to be the same. If we close this, it's just a busy node. You can see it's using a bunch of resources. This is also a very old node. I think it's running like what is this thing running? Yeah, there, a Xeon, an E3-1271. So it's like a 8-year-old CPU. So that's another part of the problem, is it's just slow. My home lab has been largely decommissioned and pulled apart for variants because I haven't been doing a lot of this type of stuff lately. So rest in peace, home lab. You've served your purpose well. Anyways, well, apparently neither one of these is going to complete here on the stream, which is a little bit disappointing and a little bit frustrating. But But what I can definitely encourage you to do is check out the blog post. The blog post just walks through all of the same steps that I've done here. You can see that Ben, when he wrote this, he used KVM running on a rel host. You don't need to do this anymore. When you get down to that part, that was fixed before it was GA'd. Just like I showed before, if one of these would ever complete, here, we'll get out of that. So just like I showed before in the auth, so here we have our kubeadmin password, as well as the kube config that I can use to connect to that. So that's what happens if I do a responding? Nope. Oh, because I'm connected to the corporate VPN. So the corporate DNS server doesn't resolve locally from my network. So that won't work until I disconnect from the VPN, which is probably why this is not responding. Actually, now that I think about it, because it's trying to look it up it's trying to do connect to this. And as you can see, it fails on that. One thing that I can do is add that into my Etsy hosts, I think. Oops. Let's see if this works real quick. I said sudo. And we'll do it the naughty way. There we go. So it's being slow to respond, but hopefully, maybe it'll work. This guy's still doing his thing. All right, I'm just going to give up. Channeling my inner Johnny here. Demo's going wrong. All kinds of things happen in the way they're not supposed to. There it goes. Connection was refused. Did I specify the right host or port? Maybe not. Oh, this one has finally apparently mostly deployed. So if I do an OC get CO, it's probably, yeah, so it's deploying the cluster. If I were to go back up to my wait for, this guy should be done. Yep, Bootstrap is complete. So now I can do for install complete. It'll give me the same output. Yeah, you can see here, 42% complete. So our single nodes non-integrated install is going according to plan. It takes it a few minutes, just like it always does. And eventually this one will succeed, and then I'll have a fully running single node OpenShift cluster. You can see the point here is that I provided it all of the information that it needed, including the static IP configuration data. It generated an ISO. I simply boot that to an ISO. I could also see where this could be interesting for some scenarios. Maybe if your vSphere admins don't want to hand over the permissions or something like that to do an IPI install. I know when I was a VMware admin, going back a few years, it always took a lot of convincing for our team when somebody, an application team came to us and said, hey, I need you to create these VMs, but don't turn them on. Don't boot them until I tell you to, because I have to stage all of these other things in order to have it correctly install, which is what an OpenShift install has to do, right? You go to the VMware team and you say, hey, deploy this OVA, create, 6 or 8 or 10 VMs, 3 control plane, 2 infra, however many workers. So create them from the OVA, but don't turn them on yet. And then, okay, OpenShift install, create ignition config, put everything up where it's supposed to be, tell them to set the VM config options. You don't have to do any of that here, right? So here, it's just, here's an ISO, please boot the VM to this ISO. And it goes through and it sets everything for us. We can get that first cluster up and running. From there, we can work out how to get the rest of this stuff set up and configured. With the VMware install, what I hope to show over here that is just not happening. I don't know. There, it's finally to the point of consuming those. What I was hoping to show over here is that the end result would be an integrated cluster. No, it wouldn't work for things like the CSI provisioner or machine set integration, because again, these credentials are not correct. But it would, in theory, it would still work, right? I would still have, you don't need these to work for a vSphere integrated cluster to deploy. UPI, IPI, it does need those to deploy. So that's not going to work here. I don't know what's going on, but my other cluster is continuing along. It's doing its thing slowly but surely. So I will check in with the product management team as well as the tech marketing team for the agent-based installer and see if they have any video demos that show this. If you want to see the whole thing all the way through. Again, this is not meant to be exciting. It's meant to be pretty boring. I create 2 files, I generate an ISO, I boot my nodes to that ISO, and then wait a few minutes and I have a cluster up and running. So live without a net. That is every day of my life, Peter. Outside scope question, OVN versus SDN, which one is preferred and why? So we have not had an episode about that in a long time, Mira. And my apologies if I am butchering names. I'm terrible with names, as my children can attest to. So a long time ago, I want to say 4.7 or 4.8, when OVN Kubernetes was first introduced into OpenShift, we chatted with Mark Curry about it. So the change with 4.12 is now OVN Kubernetes is the default SDN for all deployments. Since 4.10, 4.9 or 4.10, it's been the default SDN in some scenarios already. So for example, single node OpenShift, it was the default SDN for edge type deployments and stuff like that. So the major change is that effectively all of the testing, validation, et cetera, was done and improvements as needed so that OVN Kubernetes has both feature and performance parity with OpenShift SDN. I say that OpenShift OVN Kubernetes also has many more features than OpenShift SDN. So if I come here to the docs, going to the 4.12 documentation, say OVN Kubernetes, and if I go to this guy, there is a docs page that has some small amount of information that kind of compares the two SDNs. Here we go. So I'll post this into chat here real quick. So you can see here a list of different features that are available. So for example, if you want to do IPv6, you need to use OVN Kubernetes. If you want to do IPsec encryption at the SDN layer between nodes, you need to use OVN Kubernetes. My stance up until even now, my stance has always been go with the default unless you have reason not to use the default. So for a long time, OpenShift SDN was the default. There was no reason to change it unless you specifically needed one of these features. And I would say that the same continues to be true now. Continue with the default OVN Kubernetes unless you have a specific reason not to use it. I will say that OpenShift SDN, there is a process, and it's documented in here somewhere. Basically, you can convert from OpenShift SDN to OVN Kubernetes. But it is a one-way conversion. So if you deploy OVN Kubernetes, you can't go back to OpenShift SDN. But yeah, there's tons of additional features. All the network observability stuff that's coming out is all going to be OVN Kubernetes. There's a bunch of other features around various things. Just a ton of stuff that's happening where OVN Kubernetes is going to be the future. That being said, so far as I know, OpenShift SDN has not been deprecated yet. I don't know if it does get deprecated. It'll be a long time before it ever actually gets removed or support is removed. Having chatted with that team, one of the major drivers for the move from OpenShift SDN to OVN Kubernetes is really community support. Right? OpenShift SDN, as the name implies, is used by, well, OpenShift. And there are no other Kubernetes distributions that are using it. There's no other, third parties that are using it, nothing like that. So the community for it is one. It's a community of Red Hat. OVN Kubernetes is used by a bunch of different Kubernetes distributions. So the community is much larger. RHOPE 9. What you'll see is what he's referring to there with OpenShift SDN uses 50 byte per packet, whereas OVN uses 100. So most of the time, your MTU at the host level is going to be, at the physical host level, is going to be 1500. For the pods, for network connectivity across pods, it's going to be reduced by 50, so an MTU of 1450 for OpenShift SDN, or 1400 for OVN Kubernetes. So if you have something that is sensitive to that, having lots of, or potentially having lots of packets, just take that into account. What I was looking for here is the deprecated features here. So deprecated and remove features. Yeah, there's nothing in here. Operator images, monitoring, installation. Sorry for all the scrolling. Network, yeah. The only thing that's deprecated with 4.12 is Courier. So OpenShift SDN continues to be fully supported, fully generally available. Again, if they ever deprecate it, and I do not know, I have not heard if they have any plans to deprecate it. I expect it to be one that'll be deprecated for a large number of releases. So that way folks have plenty of time in order to figure out how to migrate off and whether or not it'll affect anything or anything like that. But again, I have not heard any rumors or whispers of OpenShift SDN being deprecated at this time. Is there a switch possible on OVN to Calico? So you can use Calico, but as far as I know, you cannot convert. That being said, that conversion would be managed by the Tigera automation, Tigera operator or whatever. So you would have to check with their documentation and see what they have possible. My experience, I've deployed Calico a handful of times. It's always been at cluster install time. So I can't really answer that. It does not use Calico by default. So by default, historically it's been OpenShift SDN. As of 4.12, the default is switched to OVN Kubernetes. All right, I'll do one last check-in over here to see what's going on. Oh, hey, look, there, it finally finished. So if I cd into my blue directory, same thing. I have my agent ISO in my auth directory. So at this point, and unfortunately we're out of time. So at this point, I would be able to switch over, mount it onto my virtual machines, and expect them to boot and have my cluster available. We can see here our cluster, our single node OpenShift cluster is progressing, albeit slowly because of my ancient hardware. But it's at 84+% complete. If I stop watching that and do an OC get CO, yeah, you can see things are marching along, however slowly they happen to be going. But yeah, so that's agent-based installer. Again, straightforward. I hope it's straightforward. I hope you all understood the process. If not, you can always reach out to me. You can reach out directly, andrew.sullivan@redhat.com. I'm happy to answer any of those questions, as well as put you in contact if you have any questions, with the product team for agent-based installer. But the big thing to me is, use case wise, I find this one to be pretty convenient for, instantiating clusters. This may be how I now deploy all single node OpenShift clusters from now on. Because I run one command, it spits out an ISO, and now I'm good to go. I don't have to worry about, deploy the OVA, set some VM options inside of here, before you'd have to go in and get out of here. So before I'd have to go in and edit this guy and go over here to VM options and go down to advanced and find the configuration parameters and go in and set stuff for like the static IP and all this. Now it's one, it's the two files. So with my agent config, I'm setting a static IP for my single node OpenShift. So this may become my preferred method because it's faster, in my opinion, even than using the assisted installer. Assisted installer, I still have to go through and click a bunch of stuff in the GUI. This way, I have one YAML file that I keep, and as I need to reinstall things or redeploy, I can keep doing that. So, Peter, install Red Hat OpenShift on-prem with the agent-based installer. Okay. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Peter. So I'm assuming that's the demo video that they created. Can I? Nope. The interface that I have here won't let me click on that. Yeah, that's exactly what that is. Released 7 days ago. Nice. So hopefully that URL, yeah. So that YouTube video that Peter PC Lauterbach there chatted is a video that shows exactly what we're looking at here. Right? It's the demo of that process end to end. All right. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you joining me today. I hope this has been informational. I hope it's been useful. Again, you can always reach out to me at andrew.sullivan. I'm going to turn this guy off now so you can see me again. So you can always reach out to me at andrew.sullivan at redhat.com. You can also reach out to me on various social media at Practical Andrew. There is also a Slack channel on Kubernetes Slack that I'm going to copy link. I'm going to publish through here as well. So you can always join the Kubernetes Slack and be able to interact with us there. Both Johnny and I are on that Slack channel, in addition to a whole bunch of other Red Hatters and community folks and all kinds of other things that are going on there. So I find it's a great way to interact with us. Again, I will be better. I'm tweaking as soon as we end our stream here. I'm tweaking my Twitter settings so that way I actually get notifications for things. I'm not a Twitter person, so I don't monitor it constantly. But apparently, I was not getting like literally any notifications for the last couple of months. So I'm going to fix that. So at Practical Andrew is a good way to get me there, as well as on Reddit. I frequently haunt both the OpenShift and Red Hat subreddits, so you can always ask questions there if you have anything. That being said, again, I won't be here next week, but Johnny should be here. So we'll figure out what the topic is and go from there. And don't ever hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week and great weekend. Bye now.